Welcome back to another video tutorial brought to you by thevirtualinstructor.com. Today we're going to be doing a watercolor demonstration. You'll need some watercolor pencils. You'll also need a brush. This is a gold nylon brush. You'll need a small container of water, and you may want some Q-tips. We're going to start off with a clean sheet of white watercolor paper. I would suggest watercolor paper over regular drawing paper, as the paper may bow a little bit. I'm going to just begin drawing. We're going to do a drawing of 3 apples on the table, and I'm going to draw very loosely with the watercolor pencil. Notice I'm not using graphite here, but instead I'm using the watercolor pencil. I'm going to draw both of my red apples first, very lightly. There's going to be a green apple in the center, and there's the green apple. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and start coloring a little bit. I'm going to start coloring in the areas where the value is going to be darker first. That's because since these are watercolor pencils, they behave a lot like watercolor. So when you're using watercolor, you have to start generally in the darker areas and leave the lighter areas alone. You can always get darker, but it's very hard to get lighter when you're using anything that's water-based, watercolor in particular. So since we're using watercolor pencils, we want to be very careful that we don't get too dark too quickly. After I've colored in all the darker values on the apples, I'm going to go back and add a little bit of color. There are some yellow areas in these apples, so I'm going to go ahead and take a yellow watercolor pencil and start filling in those areas. Next, I'm going to take a little bit of blue, and blue might seem like a strange choice, but it's going to be in the shadowed areas. So a little bit of blue here is a good choice, actually, because most shadows are cool in nature. So blue is a cool color, so by adding a little bit of blue, we're creating a more natural and cool shadow. So that's what I'm doing right here. I'm going to do it on all 3 apples. And after I've got some of the shadows indicated on the apples, I'm also going to go underneath them and indicate some of the cast shadows that are going to exist on the table. And you may notice that I'm just putting the watercolor pencil on in a crosshatch pattern and being very loose with my application, not trying to get too detailed. This is not about detail here. This is just about putting color and value information down first. I'm also going to give a little indication of the background color. I'm choosing an orange for the foreground and a blue for the background. Blue is a cool color, so it recedes. Orange is a warm color, so it comes forward. And that's going to help with the foreground and background. Also, blue and orange are complementary colors, so there should be some contrast there. Next, I'm going to get my water ready, get my brush loaded up with a little bit of water. You don't need a large brush for this. As you can see, when I add some of the water, the color actually becomes like paint, and you can move it around like you would watercolor paint. You'll also notice that when I'm making the marks with the brush loaded with the water, I'm trying to go across the cross contours of the apple. This is going to help me define the form of the apple a little bit better. And what I mean by that is there's little tiny lines on the apple, and I'm trying to follow those little tiny lines when I'm making my brush strokes. I'm thinking about the form of the apple when I'm making these strokes. I'm not just making random applications of the water. So it's important for you to think about cross contour lines when you apply your strokes. And this is true with any type of painting, not just watercolor painting, but acrylic painting, oil painting, any type of painting at all. You'll also notice how some of the colors, when I add them, they naturally mix on the surface. That's something you might want to keep in mind when you're using the watercolor pencils. It's okay to stay loose with the brush strokes. You don't have to get too detailed too quickly with this. And you can see I'm being very loose with my brush strokes, not worrying about detail just yet. Go ahead and add a little bit of water to the shadowed areas. You can see when you add the water, it becomes a little blurry, which is natural. That's what you could expect. This is actually just the first layer of color that we're putting on here. It's kind of like an underpainting. We're going to go back and increase the depth in the color and push the values a little bit further once we've got this first coat of color tended to. I'm paying very special attention to the white areas, the highlights on the apples, because I want to not get too dark too quickly, like I said previously. So it's okay to leave some white areas. In fact, you should probably always leave some white areas because there's probably going to be some areas of highlight, especially on a shiny surface like these apples. All right, we've just about got the first layer of paint accomplished here. And if you want kind of a light, airy painting, you could stop right here, but I'm not going to. I'm going to go a little bit deeper with the color. So I'm going to go back, and after this first layer has dried, of course, I'm going to go over it with some more of the watercolor pencil. And this time I'm going to put a little bit more pressure on the pencil, and I'm going to build up the darker values a little bit more. This is going to increase the contrast, and it's going to make our colors a little bit more rich. Now, this is a good time to mix your colors. If you're creating an orange color, for example, use yellow and red to make that orange. If you're creating a purple, red and blue, and so on. I'm also going to use not just red on this, but I'm also going to use a little bit of a deep brown. So I'm going to use a dark brown, and the dark brown, it looks like a black, it's actually a dark brown. That dark brown is going to mix with some of the blues that I put down prior, and it's going to create more of a natural shadow. In fact, since we're on the topic, I encourage you always to stay away from black, especially when you're painting. If you have to have something that's a really dark value that looks like black, it's a better idea to use blue and brown to make a black. Now, of course, you can use black to mix with the color, but I would avoid using flat black, unless, of course, your image is a black and white image. All right, this is what I was talking about just a minute ago. I'm adding some yellow to my orange table in the background just to give the color a little bit more depth. And you can see, even without applying any water, the color is getting a little bit more depth just by me adding the pencil on top of what we already painted. I've also added a little bit of purple to the background, and now I'm gone back and I've started to add my second layer of water. And you can see the color is a lot more rich than it was before. There's more definition in the form of the apple as well as the details that are in the apple. And our brush strokes going in the direction of the cross contours is starting to pay off now. You can start to see those lines that happen in the apple that help to define the form. Now I'm going to show you how to use this little Q-tip. Now if you want to pull up some of the color, all you have to do is put the Q-tip in some water and rub it over the surface, and actually pulls up some of the color. A little watercoloring trick. Works great with the watercolor pencils as well. You can see some of that purple that I added in the background now showing through a bit as I'm adding the water. And again, this just gives the color a little bit more depth. And that's pretty much it. That brings us to the end of this video tutorial on watercolor pencil techniques. Hope you've enjoyed this video, brought to you by thevirtualinstructor.com.